I first wrote my abstract for this conference before the onset of our current pandemic, and the attitude I took towards collapse and survival ran counter to traditional notions of apocalypse. Far from the sudden onset impact of a rogue asteroid or the frenetic sprint of a zombie plague, the horror of Ubik is one of slow regression, human impotence in the face of runaway entropic forces which not only degrade and destroy, but literally revert the symbols of human progress into nascent, underdeveloped versions of themselves. In light of the rapid onset of COVID, this somewhat contrarian attitude towards the idea of the sudden collapse seems almost naive, even ignorant. But as we emerge, newly vaccinated and more aware than ever of the dangers posed by disease and economic collapse, it seems to me that slow death is once more the threat to look out for. Runaway climate change, the spectre of political and social regression, antibacterial resistance, and looming resource shortages are at once urgent and passive, unmissable but invisible. Sourcing Plato and Tibetan Buddhism, encompassing cryogenic preservation, psionic resistance, and divine intervention, Philip K. Dick's Ubik is a story of endurance and progress in the face of a malicious, active entropy. It also, as the great Kim Stanley Robinson has noted, signposts a shift in emphasis in Dick's work from interpersonal relationships and private stories from his short stories and early novels to larger nature of reality problems. Peter Fitting has called it one of the most important science fiction works of the 1960s. Assassinated in a bomb blast, Ubik's protagonist Joe Chip is cryogenically stored in half-life, his consciousness and spirit, because Ubik is a spiritual book, are preserved artificially, hovering on the precipice between life and death. Death, true death, in Dick's book, means reincarnation, modelled after the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Glenn Runseter, founder of anti-psychic organization Runseter Associates, dials in to speak with his wife and half-lifer Ella and business partner to speak about her oncoming reincarnation. Well, like they say, you're heading for a new womb to be born out of, and that smoky red light, that's a bad womb. You don't want to go that way. That's a humiliating, low sort of womb. You're probably anticipating your next life or whatever it is. He felt foolish talking like this. Normally he had no theological convictions, but the half-life experience was real, and it had made theologians out of all of them. It's telling that nobody in Dick's book who comes close to reincarnation experiences anything but the smoky red light supposedly representing fornication and lust. Characters in Ubik draw their own conclusions about the moral implications of this, but characters in Ubik are often wrong, and not even proof that an afterlife exists can placate humanity's doubts about its meaning or its nature. And not just this, Runseter seems almost bored talking about this, eager to get on and talk business, not as concerned about his wife's next life. Later in the novel, Joe is assaulted by Jory, a ravenous psionic half-lifer intent on consuming Joe's own essence, and his thoughts return in this moment to entropy and reincarnation and fate. The body means weight and heat. Now weight is a force which I'm succumbing to, and heat, my heat, is slipping away, and unless I become reborn, it'll never return. This is the destiny of the universe, so at least I won't be alone. The preservation of a half-lifer's consciousness in Ubik isn't permanent, and souls start bleeding their energy immediately. In the end, they are returned through reincarnation to the natural, quote-unquote, cycle of rebirth. Half-life isn't a survival at all, merely a stretching out, less an afterlife and more an extended dying. Jory, a child, is able to sustain himself and produce reality constructs in Half-Life by consuming the energy of others, robbing them of their reincarnations. This shorter life makes the usually abstract, universal concept of entropy an immediate, physical reality. In the same way that the rapid life cycle of moths in the real world can show us evolution in action, the swift decay of Half-Life makes entropy real, visceral, and terrifying. Close to the end, when they're being consumed by Jory, the characters feel the heat death of the universe. They feel it in their own heat death. That which is personal is also abstracted and visceral. Even in the real world, before his death, Joe is exposed to entropy and scarcity and the oppressive requirements of maintenance, disposal, and repair imposed on a modern technological life. He is alienated from traditional skills and instead tied to an automated life, which is in turn tied to his wealth. Joe is visited early in the morning by a colleague who brings along a young woman who Joe has never met, and Joe panics because his apartment's in quite a state. Her, in alarm, Joe Chip said, "My app's unfit to be seen. I'm behind in my payments to the building cleanup robots. They haven't been inside here for 2 weeks." It's not just the cleaning. A little later on, Joe finds himself unable to leave his apartment, his exit blocked by an implacable automatic door. "What I pay you," he informed it, "is in the nature of a gratuity. I don't have to pay you." "I think otherwise," the door said. "Look in the purchase contract you signed when you bought this Conapt." Sure enough, payment to his door for opening and shutting constituted a mandatory fee, not a tip. Later on, when Joe believes Runsiter, his boss, dead from the bomb blast, and himself the newly minted director of Runsiter Associates, he celebrates the end of his money troubles. Dick makes a mockery of this. As regressive forces take hold of Chip's half-life, his money reverts to older, unusable forms of currency, useless paper. Something else happens to Joe's money as well. The bills and coins not regressed instead suddenly bear images of the supposedly recently deceased Runsiter, who, as far as Joe can tell, is trying to reach him either from the outside living world or from the afterlife. Joe doesn't know who is where. Joe doesn't know whether he died or whether Runsiter did. One of them is being held in half-life. It's impossible to tell which at this point. The Runsiter money represents another force, one running counter to the decay, a lifeline dropped to the half-lifers fighting the tide. In short, Ubik. Joe's colleague Don ruminates on this force. "I think these processes are going in opposite direction. One is a going away, so to speak, a going out of existence. That's process one. The second process is a coming into existence, but of something that's never existed before. The idea of two contrary forces, one vital and iterative, and one desiccating but simultaneously revealing, follows Dick into the theological and philosophical labyrinth of his exegesis. Time is an iterative, developing the world around us. Dick calls this a negentropic force, one opposed to the entropic force, which pairs back and regresses, revealing the Platonic ideals latent within. In Ubik, the forward-moving force of time, or time force expressed as an ergic field, has ceased. All changes result from that. Forms regress, the substrate is revealed, the bare bones, so to speak, of the world, our world, are revealed. If time stops, this is what takes place, these changes, not frozenness, but revelation. I find this idea really interesting, that when time stops, when progress stops, we see not a pause but a regression, that without the momentum of progress, the default isn't stasis, but reversion. As Lee Braver has pointed out, this model of two forces follows the basic contours of a Gnostic dualism, a framework Dick became greatly attached to after his own pseudo-religious experiences, and on which he iterated relentlessly in the exegesis, his colossal, unfinished metaphysical diary. It was the evil deity, which Dick says he encountered first, and he built Ubik, he built the positive, negentropic force as a reassurance that a benign, more powerful deity was possible and could protect him from reversion. In Ubik, as Jory's own spiritual strength begins to wane, degradation of the false reality he's built around Joe accelerates. Joe, stumbling around a deteriorating world, grabs a 1939 LaSalle motorcar. By the time he abandons the car, it's a 1929 fabric-top Ford coupe. Strangely enough, our own global silicon shortage in the real world is forcing car manufacturers to technologically strip newer models, reversing the trend of computerizing cars and paring vehicles back to their original ideal forms. The reality of peak oil means that unless we innovate, we may someday find ourselves back on horseback. Dick also foresaw the rise of artificial meat substitutes, and his colleagues get a kick out of eating real cow meat when their hotel restaurant regresses to a time when it was still available. Joe himself, now trapped in the 1930s, actually begins to enjoy the machinery and tactility of a less technological life. That is, until he talks to a cab driver about the war in Europe and the Jewish question and America's place in the world. Then Joe remembers what regression can really mean. In the novel, only Ubik can arrest this decay, a spray can whose contents can undo this temporal reversion. It exists, as Christopher Palmer has written, somewhere between commodity and deity. Its effects aren't permanent, though. Regression must be fought constantly. the spray reapplied piece by piece. When Joe finds himself facing extinction, he summons, by sheer force of will, Ella Runsiter, who hands him a coupon for a lifetime supply of Ubik before she moves on to reincarnation. Advertisements for Ubik litter the novel, and a pseudoscientific explanation citing protophasons and ionized particles signals it as a human innovation as much as a gift from God. Ella encourages Joe, his coupon in hand, to continue her fight, and trusts him to be a bulwark against Jory and the absolute spiritual collapse he represents. The project of Dick's work is an ontological one, and when Glenn Runsiter, supposedly alive, finds a Joe Chip dollar in his pocket, the struggle suddenly juts out into his world and potentially into ours.